Kia ora team, welcome back to the Year 10 Living World series. This lesson is all about sexual and asexual reproduction. In this lesson, you'll be learning about DNA, mitosis, meiosis in relation to reproduction. You'll also be learning about how fertilization happens. And you'll also be learning about the advantages and disadvantages of asexual and sexual reproduction. By the end of this lesson, you should be able to describe the role of DNA, mitosis, and meiosis in reproduction, describe what happens to gametes and chromosomes during fertilization, and compare the advantages and disadvantages of sexual and asexual reproduction. So do you remember our birds of paradise friend here? He's definitely bringing out his best moves and brightest colors to charm this female to mate with him. So, what's the point of reproduction? Why do some animals go through such great lengths to reproduce? Well, living organisms reproduce so they can pass down their adaptations or traits to their offspring. Also, living organisms reproduce to create new individuals in their species to replace the individuals that die off. If reproduction fails, then the species may become extinct. So how does an organism like this polar bear actually pass down their adaptations or traits to their offspring? Because adaptations or traits are not just something you can hand over to a baby or a cub after they're born. You can't just be like, here you go, have fun. The instructions or the code for these adaptations actually lie in the organism's DNA. DNA is this really long strand of chemical molecule that's kind of like a recipe book right here. DNA is like a recipe book, because it has its own unique code of letters, which when put together in a particular order makes sense, and it codes for all of the adaptations or traits you have in your body. So everyone has their own unique DNA molecule. Everyone has their own unique recipe book that makes them who they are and different from others. Organisms of different species most definitely have different DNA molecules. See, my DNA is very much different to this DNA of the polar bear here, because my adaptations are very different from the adaptations of that polar bear. Now, remember how I said DNA is very long? One DNA molecule is actually 2 meters long. That's the height of the door we have in this classroom. And all of that DNA has to be packaged into a cell. And a cell is really tiny. The largest human cell is actually a female's egg. And Miss Adviento will now pause the video to show you just how small a cell is. So how do we fit a 2 meter long DNA molecule in that tiny space? Cells are amazing because listen to this. Our cells package all of that 2 meter long DNA molecules into structures called chromosomes. And once they're in these structures called chromosomes, they comfortably fit inside a tiny cell. A chromosome is kind of like a ball of yarn, and the yarn is the long DNA. When it's rolled neatly into a ball of yarn, it's now called a chromosome. This DNA, packaged into chromosome and stored inside our cells, is what gets passed onto our offspring. That's why we have similar adaptations or traits to our parents, because we have inherited some of their DNA. Now you've got to learn that there are 2 types of reproduction. There's sexual reproduction and asexual reproduction. Sexual reproduction is where 2 sex cells or gametes are combined to produce offspring. This combination or fusion event is called fertilization. For fertilization to happen, 2 parents are needed, 1 female and 1 male parent. Each parent contributes 1 sex cell. So the female contributes an egg and the male contributes a sperm. Another word for a sex cell is gamete. When these 2 sex cells fuse or combine, they mix their DNA. That's why most people look half like their biological mother and half their biological father. Their adaptations or traits are a mixture of their 2 biological parents. So you're probably wondering, what does this fertilization event actually look like? Well, here's a GIF that shows how fertilization happens in general. Sperm swim to the egg and burrow. They dig a hole into the egg to pierce its outer shell. The first sperm to reach the egg wins and gets to contribute its DNA to the offspring. The others lose. Once fertilization happens, the egg and the sperm are now called zygote. This zygote is just 1 cell. When that 1 cell divides to 2, to 4, to 8, to 16 cells, that is now called an embryo. The embryo becomes a fetus, the fetus becomes a baby, the baby becomes a child, the child becomes an adult. So, the result of sexual reproduction is that all offspring made through sexual reproduction get 50% of their DNA from the male parent and 50% of the DNA from the female parent. But the offspring are genetically different from their parent. You look like your parents, but you're not exactly like one of your parents. You're still genetically different from your mum and your dad. And all offspring are unique. So brothers and sisters and all the siblings that come from the same parents are unique. They look different from each other. So this diagram shows what happens during fertilization. Now this diagram is only using a human example, so just keep that in mind. Females carry eggs, and those eggs have 23 chromosomes. Male carries sperm, and those sperm carry 23 chromosomes. When the egg and the sperm combine to form a zygote, their 23 chromosomes get added together. 23 plus 23 equals 46 chromosomes. Then remember, this zygote is just a single cell. Once a single cell multiplies, it becomes an embryo. And the embryo also has many cells with 46 chromosomes inside each cell. Now this diagram looks slightly different to the one before because this is a different species. This is the yellow fever mosquito that's responsible for spreading diseases like dengue fever, Zika fever, yellow fever. The eggs and the sperm only have 3 chromosomes each, compared to the 23 in humans that we saw before. So during fertilization, when the egg combines with the sperm, 3 chromosomes get added to another 3 chromosomes, and so the zygote has 6 chromosomes, which will lead to an embryo with many cells, and each cell containing 6 chromosomes. I just wanted to show you that different species have a different number of chromosomes in their cells. So you're probably wondering, where do all these gametes come from? How are they made? Well, I won't go into too much detail, but gametes are made through a process called meiosis. It's very important you know this word, meiosis, where the number of chromosomes at the start is halved. Let's have a look at this table down here. Up here, I've got the normal number of chromosomes, and then after meiosis, this is the number of chromosomes in the sex cells or in the gametes. As you can see, the number up here gets halved into the gametes, okay? 46 is halved to become 23. 6 chromosomes is halved to become 3. That's due to the process of meiosis. Now I said earlier there are 2 types of reproduction. Sexual reproduction is the first one, and we'll cover that now. The next one is asexual reproduction, and that's the exact opposite of sexual reproduction. With asexual reproduction, only one parent is needed to create offspring, and the sex cells or gametes are not even needed in this process. If gametes aren't needed, that means that fertilization doesn't happen with asexual reproduction. So the result of asexual reproduction is that all offspring made through asexual reproduction get 100% of their DNA from that one parent. Therefore, offspring are exact clones of their parents. They will have the same adaptations or the same traits as their parents, and all offspring that come from that parent, so all the siblings, will be genetically identical. They'll be clones of each other. So how does asexual reproduction actually happen? It happens through a process called mitosis. You need to know this word, mitosis. Basically, a cell with the normal number of chromosomes just makes an identical copy of itself to produce an identical cell with the normal number of chromosomes. This mitosis process isn't just used for asexual reproduction, it's also used for growth, repair, and wound healing. So you can see here, there's a normal number of chromosomes, but instead of halving, you can see that the clone has the same number of chromosomes. 46, 46, 6, and 6. Compare that with the one before, where it's 46 and you halve it to 23, and 6 and you halve it to 3. So now you're probably wondering, what's the point of having 2 different types of reproduction? What's wrong with just sticking to one? Well, there's actually a reason for things that happen in nature. And it just so happens that both asexual reproduction and sexual reproduction have their ups and downs, their own advantages and their own disadvantages. Let's start with sexual reproduction. it needs two parents to create offspring. So a major disadvantage is that sexual reproduction takes time and it uses a lot of energy. Some animals have to migrate far to find a mate, and others have to do a dance or a weird show of colors to attract partners. But for many of these species, it's all worth it because the greatest advantage of sexual reproduction is that all offspring are genetically unique. They're all different from each other. On the other hand, asexual reproduction only needs one parent. So an advantage is that asexual reproduction is quick and it saves time and energy because the organism doesn't need to go find a mate. It doesn't need to look attractive. It doesn't have to have one of those fancy dances to attract a mate. But one major disadvantage of asexual reproduction is that all of its offspring are clones of itself. There is no genetic variation. That leaves the species quite vulnerable to the environment and any of the changes that could happen in their habitat. So kapa, you've reached the end of the lesson. So by now you should be able to describe the role of DNA, mitosis, and meiosis in reproduction. You should also be able to describe what happens to gametes and chromosomes during fertilization, and be able to compare the advantages and disadvantages of sexual and asexual reproduction. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.